Welcome, Folkaloos. Welcome to Fabric of Folklore, the podcast where we unravel the mysteries of folklore. I'm your host, Vanessa Y. Rogers, and in this podcast, we enjoy the what, but really the purpose of the podcast is to get at the heart of folklore. So that is the why and the how we came to this place in our culture, and we want to understand where we come from, who we are today, and where we are going, so that we are better able to understand and better able to make decisions for our future. And today we're exploring a very exciting new national holiday called Juneteenth. It's a holiday for those of us in the United States at the very least. And the holiday was created, the name came from the combination of June and 19th, and is the first holiday in nearly 40 years. The last holiday that was created was in 1983, and that was Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And we are speaking with Ed Cotham. He's the author of Juneteenth, the story behind the celebration. He is a prize-winning author of many books and articles on Civil War history, with an emphasis on battles and skirmishes in Texas. He is also a former president of the Houston Civil War Roundtable and is active in the Civil War preservation movement. So thank you so much for joining us, Ed.
I'm delighted to be with you, Vanessa.
And before we get started on this new holiday, federal holiday, I'd love to hear a little bit more about you and how you got into studying and learning more about history, and specifically Civil War history.
I've always been interested in military history since my parents took me to Civil War battlegrounds when I was just a little boy. But I really got interested in the stuff here in Texas because we had a weekend place down in Galveston. I knew that there were some important things that happened around there, but I didn't know much about them. And so I got into it, and this was about 40 years ago, and started researching and writing books about it. And I've been giving tours and speaking and researching on this subject ever since.
Well, fantastic. And so when did Juneteenth become, when did you become aware of this celebration?
I've been aware of Juneteenth for a very, very long time because I give battlefield tours down in Galveston, which is again in an urban setting. And one of the places I would always lead people by is a particular spot that's today a parking lot, but it was a major building in June of 1865, and that is where General Gordon Granger had his headquarters, and that's where the order that resulted in Juneteenth took place. But many years ago, people kind of like you didn't know much about it. When I would take it by and say, here's something very important happened, this is where Juneteenth occurred, they would look at me kind of puzzled and say, June what? And so I started keeping notes on that and researching it over the course of the years, and worked on this book for many decades. And just as luck would have it, came out with it. And then 3 weeks later, the national holiday was declared. So
my gosh,
it was really
how
crazy.
serendipitous was that?
It really is. I mean, and it is kind of funny. I know your program's about folklore, and this is kind of a perfect subject for that, because this is something that had been folklore primarily in the African American community for many, over 100 years. And yet, my book was the first scholarly history of that event, and it only came out 3 weeks before a national holiday is declared. So we have a national holiday that's kind of following behind the people who have gravitated to this date and to this event to celebrate it.
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't heard about it, and it's kind of embarrassing because I'm from Texas, so you would think that it, since the holiday came from Texas, that it would be something that would be on my radar. But I was talking to some people earlier yesterday that I was going to be doing this podcast, and they hadn't heard about it either. So I think that a lot of people don't know about it, and so I'm really glad that you wrote this book, because obviously there was a definite need for it.
Well, I hope so. I hope I'm filling a need with it. And it helps me to tell the story about it, because over the years, the 100 years plus that this has been being celebrated, a lot of myths and kind of misunderstandings have developed about the actual events of June 19th, 1865, what happened, where it happened, how it was announced, and what impact it had. And I think as a society, we've kind of got to all sort that out now that we've
Mm,
decided to make it a national holiday and make it the primary commemoration date for emancipation.
absolutely. And so I definitely want to go into those myths and legends, but let's start with the origin story. How did Juneteenth occur?
Well, Texas was the last large body of enslaved people in the Confederacy. Throughout
Mm-hmm.
the war, Union armies had moved through most of the other states, and effectively those people had been liberated substantially earlier. But when they get to Texas, we'd never had those large Union armies marching through the state. And so there were, we estimate, well
Oh,
over 250,000 people living in slavery in the state of Texas. And they were enslaved. There was no doubt about it. They needed somebody to come and emancipate them and declare with arms that the government was there to actually enforce emancipation. And that didn't happen in Texas until June of 1865, much later than it happened in the other Confederate states.
why was it so long after the Emancipation Proclamation? Oh, why did it take 2 years for that to occur?
Well, again, the Emancipation Proclamation was kind of an odd thing anyway. Uh, what President Lincoln did in the Emancipation Proclamation is he said that as of January 1, 1863, everyone living in a state that's in rebellion or a part of a state that's in rebellion, you are free. But by the very nature of how he phrased it, he was only going to be freeing people in areas where he didn't have the power to actually free people. And so
Interesting.
these people would not be actually free until the Union armies arrived and put
Hmm.
teeth in that proclamation. And because the United States and the Union decided to prioritize the Eastern conflict with Robert E. Lee and then the Western conflict with the people in Mississippi and Louisiana and that sort of thing, they they didn't get around to putting substantial resources into Texas until the very end of the war.
So the Emancipation Proclamation only affected the Confederate states. What about the Union states? Were there slaves in those states still as well?
There were enslaved people in what we call the border states, the four states that were kind of teetering on the edges, people like, Kentucky, things like that. That these were people that they might have joined the Southern cause, but they ended up not joining the Southern cause and staying in the Union. And as a
Hmm.
result, Lincoln did not feel he had the legal power to free those people, and so the Emancipation Proclamation did not apply to them. Those people would only be freed if and when their states adopted some form of emancipation, or really what
Oh,
happened is when the 13th Amendment is ratified in December of 1865, well after Juneteenth, those
yeah.
people are completely freed. And in fact, everybody in the United States is freed at that point.
And so the event in Texas was not actually the very last slaves to be freed. There were other slaves after that.
Yes, there were, but these were the last large body of enslaved people in the Confederacy, and that's the key
I
thing,
see.
because again, this was what the whole Civil War had come to be about, was freeing the enslaved people in the Confederate States, and this is kind of the end of that major push. After that, it's mainly cleanup.
So, how did the process of freeing the enslaved people actually work?
The way it worked in Texas was General Granger showed up and issued a proclamation, the Juneteenth order, we call it, in Galveston, and then that order was published in newspapers across the state for many months. It was put on handbills, and people took it all the way around in the state. Usually, these were Union Army officials, and
Hmm.
passed them out and told the people that claimed to be the masters that they were no longer masters, and told the people who had formerly been enslaved that you are no longer enslaved. You are
Uh-huh.
a free person.
Wow, I can just imagine that would be such a messy process. I mean, I just can't, I like if you were an enslaved person and you got the notice that you were free, but you didn't. I mean, you had to wait until someone actually came with armed guards and said you can actually leave. I just can imagine there would be a lot of conflict around that. Was it messy?
It was incredibly messy, and it was incredibly confusing for everybody involved. In the book, I have a chapter that is primarily accounts by the people that had been freed about what it was like to be freed, and by and large, they were not surprised by emancipation. The rumors had gotten out through the informal communication network in the enslaved community about
Hmm.
Lincoln's thing. In some cases, we think the enslaved people heard about that before even the people that claimed to be their masters did in
Hmm.
1862 and 1863. But again, in 1862 and 1863, Lincoln's proclamation was just distant words on a distant paper. It didn't mean
Hmm.
anything to them. It would not be anything that had any real direct impact on their lives until the summer of 1865 when the soldiers showed up and
Hmm.
those words, became a reality for people. And like you say, the people that heard those words and were effectively freed, they regarded that as probably the greatest event in their entire life history. And
Yeah.
and they wanted to memorialize it. They wanted to celebrate it on a basis going forward. And it was
Hmm.
just a question of how and when to do that.
So you have an entire chapter devoted to people talking about what they did once they were free. Can you give us a few of those stories, a few of those recollections?
Yes, it varied enormously. I mean, one I will always remember is a lady who said that the master called him up on the porch and actually read the Juneteenth order to him, saying, you're free, but
Hmm.
we'd like you to stay here and continue working for the time being. And he read that order to him, and she said her brother just said, kissed his mother goodbye and jumped over the fence. That was the last they ever saw him. He was so delighted to be free. On the other hand,
Uh-huh.
there were some people that got that the same thing was read to them, and they said they thought about it. They went home, and then the next day they came back and they asked the former master, does that mean we have to leave? And he laughed and said,
Hmm.
no, you don't have to leave. You can stay. We'll keep on continuing to farm. This is just the new way things are changing. And then some people, they were so confused by it because this was
Mm.
such an incredible change in their lives. They
Yeah.
didn't know what to do with it. Some of them moved away and then came back. Some of them, the younger people left and went to the cities, and the older people stayed on. And again, it was different for every family because some families had a lot of elderly people there, that were just hanging on there. Some of them were tiny young children. Some of them had medical issues.
Hmm.
None of that was ironed out before you had this incredibly abrupt change. It may be the biggest change in people's lives in the history of our country, and it happened, in terms of timing, almost like turning a switch. It really happened so quickly that it was not worked out.
Pretty well. Yeah, I would imagine you would feel very rudderless because it would be really difficult to, I'd imagine, find work, unless, I don't know what it looked like back then, but like, where would you live and where would you find money to support yourself? I just imagine that would be a really difficult process.
Well, and also keep in mind that most of these people, they didn't live in cities. They were out in,
Hmm.
in in the country, and most of them were agricultural laborers on, you know, plantations or farms out in the country doing things. And it's not like there's a an established system of wages that you're entitled this much an hour for doing
Right.
that. And even if there were, the people that ran these plantations and had all this basically ran the Texas economy, a lot of their personal wealth had been in the value of their slaves, which were now worth zero. And so
Hmm.
they didn't have, and again, they had Confederate money. They didn't have currency that really meant anything at this point. So the whole system was thrown into a complete uproar, and it would take,
Hmm.
you know, more than a generation really for things to sort of normalize out.
Yeah, I would imagine because you would just be kind of rudderless, not knowing. I wouldn't know where to even start. It would be a very difficult process, I would imagine.
One guy I liked said he said, uh, "Freedom made us happy, but it didn't make us rich."
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I would imagine that would be true. Okay. So what? You said they wanted almost immediately wanted to start celebrating this Juneteenth order. What did the celebrations start out looking like?
The celebrations were pretty dramatic almost immediately. Everybody knew that there was going to be a celebration the first year after Juneteenth. That had
Mm,
been coming for everybody knew that was coming, and in fact, the United States Army was very concerned that the former Confederates would take the opportunity to really put the foot down and commit violence against their
mm,
emancipated slaves. And so there were Army forces that were standing by in places like Galveston and Houston, and
mm,
everybody in the North was watching, saying, what is this going to be like? And then
mm,
June 19th of 1866 came about, and the celebrations were largely peaceful. And the people in Houston had the biggest one, I think, in June of 1866. Uh, they had thousands of people marching in the streets to celebrate Juneteenth. It was almost spontaneous. This was not some elaborate thing that had been planned out, but people started marching down
mm,
Main Street celebrating freedom from early on in the day. And I think that the white people of Texas at the time thought, well, all right, now they've got that out of their system. We won't have to go through that every year. They've kind of celebrated that, and that's the end of it. But
mm,
no, it spread from there. And so all of these Texas cities, including some little small ones out in the country, started
mm,
having enormous celebrations that got bigger and bigger and more elaborate as time went on. And
mm.
then, of course, it starts spreading to other states throughout the country. And today, as you may know, there are people that celebrate Juneteenth in other countries like Jamaica and Mexico and things like that.
Oh,
They
wow.
it is interesting because there's not really a sort of a natural date to celebrate emancipation. There's no July 4th for emancipation because it
Mm-hmm,
happened in many different times, many different ways, all across the country.
mm-hmm,
The reason our Juneteenth ended up kind of winning out over all the other possible dates to celebrate emancipation was that, as I said before, it was kind of the last big pocket of
mm-hmm,
enslaved people in the Confederacy, and they had been waiting so long, and they were so ready for that to be over and to celebrate that they
mm-hmm.
started celebrating it intensely and kept doing it. It's the oldest continuous commemoration of emancipation, and I think that's why it kind of ends up being almost by default the key celebration for emancipation.
And now, how did it make its way to other countries? Why would is it primarily Americans in those countries that have immigrated to those countries, or is it just you know an idea of emancipation from slavery in general is being celebrated?
It's a little both. For example, in Mexico, there were a number of enslaved people that were freed in Texas that went across the border and started working in Mexico, and those families have grown up there. And so
Hmm.
there's a tradition of that just from American people going over there. But in places like
Hmm.
Jamaica, it's not that at all. It's just that there's almost not a natural date to celebrate emancipation in our whole hemisphere, and this is kind of by default becoming one of the ones that people are looking at. It also helps, frankly, that the timing of this event happened in the middle of June. It's a great time to be outside. It's a good, it's a good. The weather is good. Typically, it's a good place to have a celebration. If they had chosen, as they could, January the 1st, which was the actual date of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation,
Uh-huh.
that would have been on New Year's Day. That would have
Yeah.
been
O-
bad weather, wouldn't have been a great
Overshadowed.
time to be outside. It would have been
Hmm.
overshadowed. Some people said, and there was actually a debate and a vote on this in Austin, Texas. They said, let's just have Juneteenth on July 4th, and we'll say that it's our July 4th Independence Day. And so all of us will celebrate independence on the same day.
Hmm.
And Black people gathered at a large gathering in Austin and voted overwhelmingly that they did not want to celebrate emancipation on
Hmm.
July 4th, that was not the holiday that they were celebrating. They
Hmm.
wanted it to be special, they wanted it to be unique, and
Hmm.
Juneteenth is as unique as it gets.
Hmm. Well, and I remember reading a speech by I'm gonna Frederick Douglass, is that and he spoke at a July 4th event. I think he lived during Lincoln's time, and he am I saying that right? Is it Frederick
Yes.
Douglass? Yeah, and the speech itself was very searing because he said, "This is not my holiday, because this was not a holiday that was intended for my people." And so I would definitely see that there would be a disconnect between Independence Day and Emancipation. Uh, they aren't the same for Black people.
Right. It's kind of interesting to me that Juneteenth developed the way it did because most all of our national holidays start with some act by a government. The government says we're gonna celebrate Thanksgiving on this date. And we're all going to celebrate in this way. We're going to celebrate the 4th of July because of this event that happened by the government.
Mm-hmm.
This is not that. This is a
Mm-hmm.
celebration that developed when the Juneteenth order was originally issued. uh, it did not get a lot of press
Mm-hmm.
anywhere in Texas, in the North, anywhere. It was considered pretty much a routine order at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But because of the way it operated and the way it led to liberation, so for so many hundreds of thousands of people, it achieved a lasting significance. And those people and their descendants are the ones who created and made that holiday. And so I think it's really unique
Mm-hmm.
in American history as a holiday that was created by the people and not by the government itself. The government was long behind the people that had chosen to celebrate this holiday ever since 1865.
Yeah, obviously, because how long ago was that? Uh, Nearly, I mean, 170 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. Okay, so have you participated in any of the celebrations?
Yes, I'm very active in the celebration of Juneteenth, particularly down in Galveston, where I spend a lot of time. But uh, I again, I encourage. Juneteenth is not just for Black people in America. Juneteenth is something we all need to celebrate because it's about human freedom and the way it came to be achieved in this country. And again, the people that fought and died for it in the Civil War, large numbers of those people were white people, and I think it's particularly important that everybody celebrates this holiday.
And in Texas, I would imagine that, and I don't know because I don't know the history that intricately, but I would imagine that the slavery didn't just encompass Black people. Did it include Native Americans and other people of other races, or was it primarily uh, those brought over from Africa?
It's primarily Black people in Texas, although there are, as you say, some Native American and some Hispanics as well, and a
Mm-hmm.
lot of mixed race people we
Mm-hmm.
had here in Texas as well.
Okay, so in those celebrations that you've taken a part of, what does that look like?
It The celebration started again with this idea of parades and picnics. That's sort of the way it started, and then it got gradually more elaborate, and the tradition developed of having shared food and barbecue and music. And in the 60s we started having blues music into the events,
Mm.
and it's now morphed into a basically a cultural celebration as well as a commemoration of a historic event.
So, what are some foods that are at these events?
Oh, the classic African American, soul cuisine is there. Barbecue is there.
Mhm.
There's a lot of great food at Juneteenth events. Some of the best food I've had, frankly, is at some of those events.
And what do you think the government is going to? I imagine that there's going to be now that it's a federal holiday, that there will be more larger events that are put on by government agencies. Do we have any idea what those are going to look like?
No, at least I don't, and I kind of hope that that doesn't happen. Frankly, I
Mm,
would hate it if this turned into something that was a made-for-TV special event. Juneteenth was always about the communities and the people and the families, And
Mm.
I don't think it needs to be something that fills football stadiums and has rock concerts associated with it. This is about celebrating something that's special. I would like to see it focus more on the actual events of Juneteenth and what it means, because I think a lot of people, as you say, don't really understand yet what
Yeah.
this holiday is all about and what the appropriate way to think about it is.
When I was researching the Juneteenth, one of the things that I came across was that a lot of communities that put this on have three main goals in mind, and it was to celebrate, to educate, and to agitate. Is that something that you have seen in your research?
Yes, it is, and I think that probably is a good summary of what goes on with it. Down in Galveston, just to give you an idea, about 10 years ago, we didn't have anything really to memorialize Juneteenth. Where this thing had actually originated, ground zero for Juneteenth in the United States,
Hmm.
there wasn't a single historical marker. There was absolutely nothing.
Hmm.
And then a friend of mine named Sam Collins decided that that needed to change, and he committed his own personal resources to make sure that a historic marker was put up there at the site of Juneteenth.
Hmm.
And today there's a an art gallery right there next to the site of it. That's the Nia Cultural Center that has exhibits of art by Black artists that focus on a lot of things, including slavery and the end of it. And it's a wonderful thing. And then they got an artist, Reginald Adams from Houston, to come and paint an enormous, colorful mural on the side of the building so that everybody walking up and down the Strand, which is Galveston's main street,
Uh-huh.
cannot help but confront the fact of that Juneteenth took place right here. And I like that. I like the
Hmm.
way that it developed a little bit at a time, and
Organically.
now it's ready to take off.
Hmm. That's beautiful. What does the mural look like?
It has a number of things in it. It has a picture of General Gordon Granger, who's often associated with Juneteenth up there, and he's standing there signing the general orders. But what I like about it is in the background of General Granger are some black troops from the United States colored troops,
Mm-hmm.
and that's interesting because there were, in fact, black troops on ships in Galveston Harbor on June 19th of 1865. And very
Mm-hmm.
soon after Juneteenth, a majority of the troops in Texas would be black troops, just because the white troops were in the process of being mustered out, and the new black regiments were coming down to help pacify the state. So it 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 is an accurate
Mm.
thing. And one of the neat things about it is one of the people that was actually there in Galveston on Juneteenth was a black soldier whose mother had been the subject of a lawsuit to establish her freedom and then his freedom. And the lawyer who had defended her and gotten her freedom declared was Abraham Lincoln back when he was a lawyer, not a
No, that's
politician,
amazing.
and just happened to be in Galveston on Juneteenth.
Wow. That is really amazing. So back to the three goals: the celebrate, the educate, and the agitate. How is the educate part done?
Education or agitation, I'm sorry.
No, educate.
Okay,
The
education. Uh,
hmm.
the way you educate people about Juneteenth, I think, is multiple ways. Again, I do that through my historical
Hmm.
work. I do that through speeches, and I do that through leading tours because we have a freedom walk, we call it, where we start at various places around Galveston associated with Civil War, and we talk about, not only the freedom message of Juneteenth and where it was posted and where it was delivered and those sorts of things, but then the various civil rights milestones around the city. When you know where were the first black schools? Where were the
Mm.
first desegregation efforts taken? There are a whole host of things like that, and we're starting to see people come down to Galveston not just to go to the beaches, but to learn about this event and what it means for not just the Galveston community, but for them and their children. And getting the children involved is really, really key to this whole thing. I'm
Hmm.
giving a tour this week to kids down in Galveston to, and I always include Juneteenth as part of that tour
Hmm.
because I think it's so important that they know the story.
Hmm. And so at these celebrations, do they have like, um, do they do reenactments or do they have speeches that talk about slavery? What does that look like?
Yes, there are a lot of people that deliver speeches, and when we dedicated when the national holiday was declared, we
Hmm.
had United States Senator Cornyn and one of our House Representatives, Sheila Jackson Lee, come and speak, and pretty much we do have the standard politicians speak every year at these events, but it's not just the politicians. We want to hear from artists. We want to hear from
Hmm.
poets. We want to hear from musicians that have ideas to celebrate it. It's not, again, this is not a holiday that's all about politics.
Right.
This is a holiday that's about culture and freedom, and we want to continue to emphasize those things.
And so the third part of the goal, so it was celebrate, educate, and agitate. How do you think the agitate part is accomplished?
We never give up on this. Freedom is a goal, but it's something that's kind of always out there. You've got to always be working to make sure that it happens, and
Hmm.
it's never really actually achieved. Uh,
Hmm.
one of the most interesting parts about the Juneteenth order is this. The first sentence of it just says, in accordance with the Emancipation Proclamation, all slaves are free. The last two sentences are really kind of embarrassing. They say, you're free, but you're free to stay right where you are, and you keep working for the same person for now, and we'll get back to you when you can do something different. So those are kind of bad
We'll
sentences.
get back to you.
Yeah, and then there's this beautiful sentence in the middle, and it
Mhm.
says, freedom means absolute equality, and absolute equality means, absolute equality of rights and property between former masters and slaves. And this sentence in the
Mhm.
middle there is beautiful, and it
Mhm.
doesn't fit with the rest of the order, and that bothered me for years and years. How did that come to be in there in the middle of this kind of conflicting things between the first sentence and the last two sentences? And then we figured out that the guy that actually signed the Juneteenth order, not General Gord Granger, it was actually his staff officer, Frederick Emory. And Emory had been a newspaper editor in Kansas before the war of an abolitionist newspaper, and he had actually joined a
Mhm.
Kansas cavalry company that was captained by John Brown Jr., the son of the famous martyr. So this guy was as anti-slavery as it was possible to come,
Mhm.
and he just happened to have this literary ability because he'd been a newspaper editor, and he just happened to be in charge of putting together the Juneteenth order. And so we have this wild order with these conflicting passages, and then this one beautiful thing there in the middle that I think was probably better than anything that anybody wrote in the Civil War about defining what freedom was about.
Mhm.
But absolute equality means absolute equality, and it's very difficult to achieve that. And that's in fact
Right.
what the mural is called at Galveston, absolute equality. But that's the goal. And I think that one of the things I like about Juneteenth is it helps us put that goal forward there and not just say, okay, well, we freed all the slaves. Now that's over. We can just get on to doing whatever we want. No, freedom's about
Mhm.
absolute equality.
Mhm.
That's the goal. You've got to keep pushing for that.
Mhm. And one of the things that I found really moving was every year at Martin Luther King Jr. Day, I like to read one of his speeches. And one of the things that I found that I didn't realize about, and I don't think I learned in school, was that he was actually not just fighting for the rights of Black people, but he was also starting to move towards talking about poverty and how that affected equality as well. And it was not just race that was being affected in freedom, but also um, the the inequality of wealth.
Yeah, I think that's correct. That's sort of the message here as well, is
Hmm.
that freedom means more than just not having slaves. It means
Hmm.
empowering people to make the most of their abilities and the most of their situations, and make sure that we lift everybody up, not just those that are rich and powerful.
Now, do you feel like the Juneteenth holiday will do anything to increase the national conversation around equality and freedom and uh, race relations?
I think it will definitely help encourage the conversation, because now you've got people that have to sit back once a year and say, all right, this is a holiday. Now, what does it mean?
Hmm.
And the yeah, I can already see since the declaration of the holiday. My book was the first on the scholarly history, but there are going to be a lot of others, and everybody's got to do that. And I like the fact that now we're starting to see children's books about this, because
Hmm.
children need to understand uh, the legacy of these events and what they mean,
Hmm.
and there's slavery is kind of scary to people for obvious reasons, but the fact that we can overcome it, and that we have that uh, vast network to go back to of people that were freed and to whom it meant something, that's important knowledge that people need to have.
Hmm. Absolutely, I agree. Um, so let's talk about the legends and myths versus the facts. What were some of those legends and myths that came about from the Juneteenth proclamation?
Well, one thing that got me to write my book was I got tired of seeing every year the standard characterizations in newspapers, and this was not uncommon. This was what was almost every newspaper would say, that Gordon Granger came to Galveston on June 19th, 1865, went up on a balcony and read this order that gave the news to the enslaved people below him that they were free.
Hmm.
And the first thing that happened was I started to say, well, gee, I wonder, surely there's some record of him actually doing that at the time. And when I did my research, there's no such, there's nobody that records anything like that.
How
He didn't go on a
interesting.
balcony. He didn't
Uh-huh.
read it. He didn't write it. He didn't even sign it. This was done by his staff officer again. And so, Gordon Granger had precious little to do with this order. As I say, it was the good parts were basically his staff officer, and the first part about freeing the slaves, he'd been told to do that by General Phil Sheridan, who had written to him from New Orleans about that. So I think Gordon Granger shouldn't get any credit for Juneteenth.
Mm.
And there are no balconies, there's no readings. I think that all came about way after the fact, when people started celebrating Juneteenth, and they figured, well, how are we going to do this? Let's have speeches, in the early days, the best way to have a speech anybody could hear was to get up on a balcony and have people
Mhm.
below you. And so that's how it kind of started. The celebration started, and
Mhm.
people over the years just got confused and thought, well, maybe that's how the original event happened too. But that's that's not the way that happened. It doesn't really matter. I mean, the Juneteenth never has revolved about speeches from balconies. It's always
Mhm.
about the message of freedom and equality.
Mhm. Right. Well, that's very interesting. Are there any others that you came across as well in your research? Any other
I,
misunderstandings?
yes, I think the biggest misunderstanding out there was that Gordon Granger showing up and reading this thing was a surprise to everybody, and that there were black people below that had never heard that this Emancipation Proclamation had happened,
Mhm.
and that this had been kept secret from them, and it was a big shock and big news. That's not the case. I mean, the
Mm.
accounts we have of historically show that the informal networks among the enslaved people was very accurate about spreading information, and they knew about emancipation. It just
Mhm.
didn't mean anything until the soldiers showed up, because Lincoln had said they were free, but the Juneteenth order made them free, and
Right.
that's the reason that they chose to celebrate that order. Because it's one thing to say somebody written something on a paper a long way away, but when you hear the word that you are now able to do what you want to because you are free now,
Yeah,
that's what you remember.
because it was actually enforced at that point.
Right.
Mhm. And the holiday, did it have ebbs and flows? Were there times when it was more widely celebrated and less celebrated? And I'm specifically thinking about during the time of civil rights movement. Was there a resurgence? Was it more highly celebrated during this time, or was there crossovers?
There were changes in the way it was celebrated over time, and I would say, particularly during maybe the '60s and the civil rights era, there were definitely some times when it kind of it didn't ever go underground, but it was probably less visibly celebrated, certainly than it is today, or than it was in the heydays. The 1870s and 1880s, 1890s. It was hugely popular at those
Mhm.
times, and the celebrations were enormously visible at those times.
Why do you think that it was less celebrated during the civil rights movement? Is it just because of the Jim Crow laws or the crackdowns from the government in general, or what do you think was the cause of that?
It's hard to say, but I think part of it is that there were too many other things going on, and people were very serious about thinking that things had to change right now, and they were thinking about how do we how do we deal with the present and not
Mhm,
how do we celebrate the past.
mm,
And
mhm.
now I kind of think we're getting back to the idea of let's figure out a way to celebrate the past and let that inform us in our views of how to make things better going forward.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So who in the past has been the I know that you said that the very first celebration was done kind of just organically, that people just kind of filled the streets with their joy, and it just happened that everybody was there at the same time. But is there someone, are there organizations that today are generally in charge of um these events? Are they just in the backyards of uh people's houses, or who's putting them on?
There's not I mean, there is a national Juneteenth organization that sort of coordinates, uh, uh, and it's really not organizing and things like that. It's mainly just kind of serving as a bulletin board to connect people with the Juneteenth resources, in their states and in their communities. But there's not like a national Juneteenth organization that is in charge of putting on a big program every year and making sure that things happen in a certain way all across the country. That has never happened, and that doesn't even happen for the Fourth of July either. But
Mhm.
that's certainly the case on this. The most interesting one to me is this. If you go back, this is even before June 19th of 1866. The very first person who I think celebrated the anniversary of Juneteenth was a guy, and we don't even know his name, but it was a man who decided that now that he was free, he was going to hold a ball, and he was going to hold a freedom ball. This was about a week after June 19th. He was going to
Mhm.
hold a freedom ball for Black people to celebrate emancipation in Galveston. And this was written up in the newspaper that this was going to happen. It happened, and the next day, the mayor of Galveston, who had been a Confederate official, then called this man into his chambers and said that he had not gotten a permit to hold this ball, and he had to pay a fine, which the man didn't have the money for, and he put him in jail. Now, what had happened was this man had actually asked one of the Union Army officers who had arrived if he could hold this ball, and the
Mhm.
officer had given him permission to do that. So when word got out that the mayor had jailed this man, the officer who had given him permission went and got him taken out of jail, and then went to the city hall and took the mayor prisoner and put him in the jail cell where he had kept this man a prisoner for the same amount of time that he had held uh, this man in jail for. So it kind of, to me, it sort of illustrates the tensions around the
Mhm.
original Juneteenth, the fact that people were enthusiastic to celebrate the anniversary almost, within a week after it happened,
Yeah.
and the fact that, it was going to take some time before everybody
Mhm.
figured out how this was going to be celebrated, and the fact that it was going to be peaceably celebrated on on all parts because that was
Hmm.
going to be important.
Oh wow, that's a really awesome story. Is there a ball? Is there a ball that is thrown every year this for that commemoration? I would imagine that would be a really um, great way to celebrate.
In Galveston, we're starting to do that more. There's a thing called, I think it's
Mhm.
called the sneakers ball. Actually, people wear tennis shoes and come to this thing, but it is sort of a an attempt to not to recreate it, but just to again celebrate it in a different form. Because
Mhm.
there's only so many parades and speeches and beauty contests and concerts you can have, and
Mhm.
it's nice to have ways to celebrate and commemorate the event that really trace the history.
That are a little bit unique.
Right.
And I read that there are some people who are starting to pilgrimage to Galveston for Juneteenth. Are you seeing that?
We are seeing more people come to Galveston and find out about it. And it's interesting because, like you say, there are some people that are deeply into the story
Mhm.
and it's deep in their cultural roots and they want to see it and they want to see everything. But then there are people that are not part of that community. And like I said, Galveston's a big cruise ship destination or
Mm,
cruise ship
mhm,
place where they come, and so we have huge numbers of people that walk from the cruise ships up and down the Strand, the business district area. And until
mm,
recently, we had nothing to show them. But now, that we have this giant mural and a historic marker, and people that never had heard about it, didn't know what it was, now are at least getting a taste for what the whole thing is about.
mhm. Yeah. And so, um, I think I've lost my question. Oh, I got it in. Um, for those who want to celebrate it this year, but might not have any idea where to even look, what would you suggest?
You can go on the Galveston Convention Bureau website and get some links to some of the Juneteenth celebration uh, activities, and there are quite a few. But in Galveston, particularly, there's a home called Ashton Villa that
Mhm,
was built in 1859 before the Civil War, and they have always had a very strong program there with speeches and things. And as I said, there's the sneakers ball that's usually the night before.
mhm,
There art gallery exhibits there on the Strand, and then the Freedom Walk, which is really interesting because we're using technology, and now you can get on your phone and you can just trace the stops on there, and you get to a stop and punch a number, and there'll be somebody, me on a couple of these things, actually telling you about the place and its connection to Juneteenth and African American history.
okay, well, great. I will I'll have we'll put that link up on our website so people can take a look at that. And um, tell us a little bit more about your book and who it was written for and who do you think will benefit from reading it.
I wrote my book on Juneteenth basically to tell the scholarly story behind the history because I knew that a lot of people had heard of Juneteenth, but they really didn't know what happened. And not only what had happened, but why it happened. Because
Hmm.
the general order that was issued in Galveston was not just something that happened by itself. It was basically the end of a whole chain of events that had started even before the Civil War and continued through the fighting and the Emancipation Proclamation orders that Lincoln finally kind of was forced to uh, put out there. And then the Army, of course, had to win a victory or none of that mattered. And all of those things happened through the end of the war and resulted in the climate that meant that Galveston was going to be the last major Confederate port, and Galveston and the Texas was going to have the last population of enslaved people, and you were going to have to do something to suddenly make the adjustment from slavery to freedom, while at the same time, they didn't want to collapse the Texas economy. They didn't want to have people starve themselves because nobody was working in the fields. All this stuff was very complicated to work
Yeah.
out, and it all just kind of happened in such a haphazard way. And
Hmm.
I thought that the story needed to be told, from the standpoint of the military people that were involved in it, the political people who had helped to lead to the result, and then the people that were freed and what they thought of what had happened and how they saw that as affecting their future lives. And all of those things were considerations when I finally put the book together.
Hmm. Well, I definitely appreciate that you wrote the book, and I feel like you are filling a great need, and I do hope to see more books on this subject, and I am excited to see the evolution of this new federal holiday and to take part in it myself.
Thank you for having me. And I tell a lot of people at the end of my speeches, Happy Juneteenth to everybody.
Well, happy Juneteenth to you as well. And thank you, Focaloos, for joining us on this exploring the history behind the longest running African American holiday with us. And I don't know about you, but I found that incredibly riveting. But of course, we do want to know what you thought. And so you can do that. You can talk to us through YouTube comments, through our Facebook group page. That is a page that we created for you so that you are able to tell us your thoughts about our different shows and tell us ideas for future shows. So definitely join that page and let us know what your thoughts are. Have you participated in Juneteenth before? Will you be participating in it this year? And if you are enjoying this podcast, definitely remember that subscribing and liking and commenting and sharing help new podcasts like us. And if you have it in your heart to take 5 minutes out of your day to give us stars, to review us and to rate us, that is so helpful and helping other people to find our show as well. So if you can take a little bit of time out of your day to do that, we definitely appreciate it. And not only are those reviews helpful, but if you share it with someone that you know, so if whether you share it on your social media or by carrier pigeon, however you want to share it, we definitely appreciate you spreading the word. And whichever works best for you. And so thanks for unraveling mysteries of folklore with us here on Fabric of Folklore. Once again, my name is Vanessa Y. Rogers. And until next time, keep the folk alive.